let's talk about game preservation. Let's start from something that's basically impossible to preserve, and yet some pretty creative people are finding ways to do it, and move our ways towards more and more preservable, more and more upgradable, more and more able to continue to exist as an active property in the world. And then, unfortunately, start the process of backsliding from that place. There are games that exist where the only thing that remains in existence are the actual physical cartridges that were made for consoles that haven't existed for decades. Back in the early days of console gaming, the cartridge contained all of the information necessary to play the game. Teams were very small, and we weren't a very mature industry in those days. So there's a pretty good chance that the code and assets and parts that were used to make the game were not preserved in any way. So when the game was finished, the team moved on to something else and needed the hard drive space and wiped their hard drives, or the company went under and those computers got sold or destroyed or thrown away. So nothing that was used to make the game exists anymore. But the cartridges still exist. But they were designed for hardware that's getting harder and harder to find. Now, we're into an area of game preservation that I'm not super familiar with, but I believe what very smart enthusiasts do is they take that cartridge and they essentially read the information off of it, and that gives them effectively a virtual version of the cartridge that is then able to run on an emulator. You can pick apart different parts of the cartridge, find places where assets are stored, find different places where code was stored. Maybe they're all blended together. Definitely a space I'm not super familiar with, but effectively with this kind of game, you are starting from something that is as far removed as being able to work on a modern PC as is possible, and you're picking it apart and putting it back together in a way that will run on a modern PC. As we move into very old PC games, we are in a similar situation, but we've removed one of the obstacles. So we have a copy of the game. Early PC games, that might just be a single executable with no asset folders, no other parts. Everything is just compiled into one executable. Indeed, in many cases in the early days, assets only existed in code. You were either hand coding in shapes or you were using algorithms to generate circles and things. And so there are no assets to be had because they're hiding within the code itself. Maybe this game was written for DOS. Maybe this game was written for a very early version of Windows, so it doesn't use DirectX. Again, for the same reasons, you probably don't have access to the source assets. What you have is this executable. You might still need to run it in an emulator. If it was written for DOS, you're probably running some sort of emulator to make it go. From a pure preservation perspective, making these games go can actually be pretty easy. There are a couple of things you do have to sometimes take into account. Some very old games don't even understand the idea that they might run at different frame rates. So when you throw a bunch of additional hardware at them, they're suddenly running at 30,000 frames a second, and the game is instantly over because you instantly get shot by an alien. So sometimes as part of your emulation process, you have to artificially slow the simulation down to allow them to run at a reasonable frame rate. For these very early games, for games where you don't have access to the source assets, remasters are pretty hard. It's hard to make that texture higher resolution or that asset have more polygons in it or more pixels in it if you don't have the original asset. You may be able to dig around in the executable and find the original asset hiding in there, but to extract it and potentially replace it with something that has a different size is a non-trivial task, because often the size will be hard-coded into the code, or at the very least, you're going to have to potentially rearrange to allow you to change those assets. Also, the assets themselves will likely have been converted into some other format that isn't necessarily easy to work with. A great example of this is the level art in Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2. These levels were packaged in this very strange way, designed to optimize their size in a streamable way. The levels are broken up into these 64 by 64 tiles that are then stored as 8-bit images, with each 64 by 64 tile having its own 8-bit color table. So as a result, you could load each individual piece, it would have all the information necessary for it to render itself, allowing you to stream the data in as you're moving around on the level. But it's not a standard format. You can't just take a level from Baldur's Gate and open it up in Photoshop and paint over it in something else. If you're trying to access the level art data from Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2, you either need the source data or you need a way to extract that data out and turn it into a format that's more easy to deal with. As we move towards the modern day, studios started to at least consider that they might want to access this source code and these assets in the future. Even if they weren't thinking about game preservation, and to be clear, they weren't, this starts to be a thing that is in people's mind. If you're making sequels, if you're making Baldur's Gate 2, maybe you want to have the gibbering mouther that you had for Baldur's Gate 1 in Baldur's Gate 2. So you want to have access to the source in order to integrate it into your next game. Most studios still aren't considering game preservation as super important to their process, but at least some of the assets are being considered valuable beyond the game that they're being produced for. We're also entering into a world where now source control for code, at least, is becoming pretty common. So again, while no one might be thinking we're going to want access to this source code in 10 years, the fact that you have some sort of source control process means that there's at least a chance that the source code survived. Now we're into the late 90s, early 2000s. Often what you find in the case of remasters from this time period is that a lot of the source code is available. Some relatively random selection of assets is available, but there are weird and inexplicable gaps. You have all of the source models that were used to build your sprites, except for 5 that are just gone, and you don't know why. You have all the source code, but you don't have the source code for this one tool that was used to package up the tile sets. So you end up with these odd and hard to predict roadblocks. But because you have the source code, game preservation is a little bit easier because it's easier to do a recompile. If you need to move to a new version of DirectX, you have a starting point. Because you have some of the source assets, you can likely build a version of the original game that runs on new platforms relatively easily. Of course, this raises the question of how pure you want your game preservation to be. Does changing versions of DirectX undermine that preservation? Does recompiling the game as a 64-bit executable instead of a 32-bit executable so that it has access to larger amounts of memory? Is that too big of a change? Early games that I worked on, like Baldur's Gate 1, had really long load times. Even just installing that game onto an SSD is going to change the experience of the game compared to what it was in the early days. So when you are thinking about game preservation, what is important to preserve? What is unimportant to preserve? What are you allowing to change in the name of making this thing playable in a modern setting? But when you're entering into remaster territory, the fact that you don't have everything is going to be a problem. You're up-resing all the cinematics and you're missing 3. So you end up in a world where you can make all the cinematics except for 3 look better. And then what do you do with those last 3? Or you cut the difference, or you find yourself rebuilding those 3 cinematics from scratch. It's a decision that needs to be made in the service of the remaster. What's worth the money? Is it worth spending the time and money to rebuild some assets from scratch in order to make them look better when you're not exactly sure how well the remaster is going to do? And you see this with some remasters where much of the game looks significantly better and then occasionally something, usually in one of the edges, simply doesn't look any better. Chances are that's not because they had the source asset and chose not to do an up-res. Because typically, if they have it, they'll do it, even if it's something that's relatively infrequently seen. Usually that's happening because there was something that was preventing an easy improvement. Either the source asset is missing completely, or there's some other reason why reintegrating a different version of this particular asset is difficult. In this time period, we are also starting to see source assets that are built to a higher fidelity than what is going into the final game that ships. In earlier days, at least on games I was working on in the late 90s and early 2000s, usually you were just working at the resolution that was going to be in the game. If this texture was only going to be a 64 by 64, you just built a 64 by 64 texture. As we get into the mid and late part of the 2000s, you're starting to see textures built to a higher resolution than is needed, and then in the build process downscaled into what the game is actually going to use. If you have those source assets, that's great for the remaster because you can get a fidelity improvement just by upping the resolution, by just down-resing the source asset less. What you actually are starting to see now is that often that higher resolution that was used isn't higher resolution enough. If you made a 1024 by 1024 texture because all you needed was a 256, well, now often assets in your game are using 4K textures. So you're 16 times smaller than you want to have now. But at least you're moving in the right direction because more and more you're considering the fact that, yes, you are going to use these assets again. Probably, yes, the source code has value. Yes, you want things to continue to be available going into the future. But even still, things still get lost if you have a proprietary database that you're using to store your strings or your conversation files. It's possible that in the process of archiving, someone forgot to export the French version of the database. So there's just randomly some piece of data that's missing from your ability to do a remaster. But it's becoming less common to have randomly missing assets. It's becoming more common to have a greater degree of rigor over what is archived when you're archiving the things that were used to build the game. Additionally, these days, most assets are going through some form of source control. So because source control is effectively an automatic form of archiving, your source assets are much more likely to survive because they are going to be in a source control depot of some form. And in the archiving process, chances are you archive that entire depot, and therefore you get all of the assets that are in there. When you're working with outsourcers, it's important to make sure that their assets are getting into your depot as well. Sometimes that doesn't happen because you don't trust them to be in your depot. So consider how you can get them into, if not your depot, some kind of source control depot so that things can survive into the future. Most of the big publishers consider archiving to be an important step in the life cycle of a project. It is something that is done as the project finishes and things are moved into some sort of centralized archive. If you don't have such a process, if you're not owned by the publisher, they might not have that requirement. In that case, think about how you are preserving the stuff you're trying to preserve. MDK2 from BioWare only existed on a single PC that was in a boardroom. Platter hard drives have a lifespan. I'm pretty confident that if someone pulled that hard drive at this point and tried to reconstruct MDK2 from that, it's probably not fully readable anymore and things would get lost. So we live in the world of better forms of media archiving. If you're trying to archive stuff, think about how it's going to be accessible in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, when it is looking like it's something that you're interested in doing. Something that is definitely proving to be a new obstacle for game preservation is always online features or call home features or any kind of feature that requires the existence of a server. If you are trying to play a game like Anthem and the servers are gone, well, most of the game logic actually exists on those dedicated servers. It doesn't even exist on the thing that's running on your PC or console. If those servers have ceased to exist, then the game is essentially dead. If you are making a remaster or a remake, no problem. Hopefully you have all the source code for those dedicated servers and you can keep them running or update them to a new architecture or move them into the cloud or whatever. But if you are someone outside the company who is simply trying to keep these games playable, it can be a big obstacle. Sometimes the addresses of those servers are hard-coded, so even if you somehow get your hands on the server code, it's not easy to make sure that things point in the right places. When I started in games, you certainly couldn't assume that the player had an internet connection. Even into Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2, we typically made a final patch that disconnected all of those online features to allow the games to continue if those servers ever went down. But that's not always done these days. So sometimes even games that appear to be fully offline have something that is drilled into the back that prevents the game from running if some of those services are gone or down or changed sufficiently. You see this in linear media as well. Used to be that a movie existed on a big reel of film. There weren't that many of those, but those pieces of film existed as long as they existed. If someone put one in their closet, 50 years later, it could be found and a movie could be rediscovered. Then we moved into a world where people had their own copies of movies. And while that media in some ways was less stable because it was magnets or the ink from the label sometimes ate through the DVD itself, there was something, and there was lots of them out into the world. But now we find ourselves in a world where a lot of media exists only in the cloud. And that cloud is controlled by a corporation. So if Disney decides they want to disappear the Willow series, they can do that. And unless someone actually recorded it themselves, it's gone unless Disney chooses to release it themselves again, which they probably won't do because they wrote it off on their taxes. As we move into more and more of a streaming landscape, a landscape where people don't physically have copies of a game or copies of a movie, regardless of what the licensing agreement actually says, as we enter into a world where you don't even have an actual copy of the thing, game preservation is very much at the will of the rights holders. And as a result, things can potentially disappear forever through malice, because they don't want things to continue. They want things to disappear because they got a tax write-off or because they feel like it reflects badly on them or whatever, or simply through some form of incompetence. The company goes bankrupt, or they accidentally catch the only server that has the copy on it on fire, or they forget to pay Amazon for the cloud storage that they're using, and Amazon wipes the hard drives. We find ourselves in a world where, without the cooperation of the original creator, game preservation and media preservation in general can be quite difficult. And there isn't a huge profit motive for game preservation at the moment. There's certainly some desire for remasters and things like that, but those are seen as relatively small and certainly relatively infrequently. And in some ways, if you're interested in doing a remaster, you might like the fact that a game becomes unavailable and unplayable for 5-10 years, so that when you finally do a remaster, there is a greater desire for it because it became lost media during that intervening time. This is what Disney used to do back in the 90s when they would put movies into the vault. They would stop selling copies of their movies for periods of time in order to essentially introduce FOMO into the buying public's mind. Right now, a lot of games can only easily be preserved with the cooperation of the companies that own those games. And a lot of companies not only don't see a benefit in doing that, in some cases see a benefit in actively working against that. Something that I was interested in doing on Joplin, something that I think Bethesda may actually do with Skyrim, is the concept of always running. Is the idea that rather than archiving, or maybe in addition to archiving, you have a version of your game that you keep running forever. As you update your engine, you go back to that previous game and you make it run with the new version of the engine. as you introduce new features, you integrate those features into the old game. For the preservation purists, it's not a perfect form of preservation because to some degree you're ship-of-theseusing your game. If you start with a game that is made in DirectX 7, and then as you make new games, that game gets updated to DirectX 8, DirectX 9, DirectX 10, and runs on higher and higher resolution versions of the textures and integrates new things around lighting. The game is changing. So what you're effectively doing is almost having an always-on remaster. Even in that world, I think you want to take some snapshots along the way in order to at least mark your progress and say, this is the version that shipped, this was the final this was the final patch version, this was the remaster we did in 2012. But by having essentially an always running remaster, you are always having something that is testing your existing code base. You have a shipped game that runs on whatever you're working on right now. And it has assets, and it has game loops, and it has progression. If your games are shifting around a lot, having your old turn-based RPG running on the same engine as you're using to make your cover shooter maybe isn't super useful. But most of the time, most studios transform what they are much more slowly than that. Having the game you made 10 years ago run on the version of the engine you're using now might actually make a lot of sense. This obviously isn't free. Typically, teams get really tired of games as they're coming out, so requiring them to continue holding it together indefinitely isn't going to necessarily be the most popular rule to have in place. And additionally, every time you add different additional work onto people's plates, it's always coming at the cost of other work they could potentially be doing. Additionally, games ship with a lot of tape and bits of wire and string holding them together. So as a result, either you need to potentially put permanent fixes in place into those just get it out the door fixes, or you need to be prepared to maintain hacks and things for the long run, which may not be super desirable. In any case, it is an intriguing policy. Don't know how practical it actually would be, but it is interesting to think about the fact that as a studio continues to iterate and improve their engine, that their older games are being elevated to some degree as a side effect of that process. Now, the end of this road clearly seems like madness. If you are working on your 10th game, are you keeping the other 9 games that came before all running on your current code base? So maybe it would make sense that there's some form of sunsetting where what you're really doing is trying to get the benefit of doing this, that you have shipped content available to be used in the new code that you're running, while still allowing games to eventually retreat into the back catalog and not drag your entire studio to a halt as you're trying to keep 10 different games running in the same code base simultaneously. A lot of movies from the early days of cinema have essentially been lost into the ether. Occasionally something shows up and is discovered in someone's basement, but a lot of stuff is simply lost because it wasn't considered important to preserve it. Similarly, we've entered into that same kind of place for games. There are games that have been lost because only a few cartridges were ever created, they weren't very popular at the time, and none of those cartridges still exist. But in a digital world, it isn't really necessary for games to disappear. It is relatively easy for games to be preserved, as long as somebody is considering it an important thing that's worth doing. In a world of live services, the servers become a necessary part of the preservation. So we have some work to be done in order to figure out how that's going to work. I don't think the right answer is to leave it to the corporations to do. I think we need to find a way so that game preservation can happen independent of the way of the people who made the original game. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're more interested in supporting the channel in that way. Both patrons and channel members get access to our Discord, so if you're interested in interacting with the community to a deeper level, that is an excellent way to do so. What are your feelings on game preservation? Do you care? Do you care about the history of games? Do you want to see more remasters? These things are related. They're not the same thing, but they are related to each other. Now that we are in a world with a lot of games that have online features, taking that into account when it comes time to sunset the servers is an important part of game preservation that is very rarely actually taken into account. What are your thoughts? Let's talk about it down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.